the day that my mom took me and we were on the bus and I asked her, when am I going to see daddy again? And she said, I don't know. And I remember when she said, I don't know, I remember my heart just kind of going, it just dropped. Like I was like, what do you mean you don't know? And then of course, you're a child. And so you start to go, well, what did I do? Like, it's my fault. And then she would add things like, well, he's a deadbeat who doesn't want you, which in my adult years, a lot of the time, it's been hard to believe that I am lovable. It took me a long time to realize that I am lovable. Every time the targeted parent responds, it breaks down the wall a little bit more. It's like, if he didn't want anything to do with me, he would not have responded. I would not have got this letter from him in February of 2019 when he introduced me as the daughter that was taken from him. I knew that was right. I knew it was right. And the words, though, I was like, he said it. And then a month later, my body gave out, just stopped working. It was like, oh no, you have to just stop what you're doing and you have to look at this.
Hi, my name is Maddie and welcome back to the Anti-Alienation Project, or welcome if you're new here. What do I talk about here on my project? I talk about a certain form of severe child psychological abuse that I went through for 20 years, also known as parental alienation. It's kind of what it sounds like. It really involves one angry parent, usually during a custody dispute or divorce, but not always, who goes on an obsessive rampage to manipulate their child into rejecting their other loving parent without true justification. This happened to me, and for 20 years, I rejected my dad without true justification because of the manipulation, lies, false accusation, and a range of alienating tactics that my mom performed. Now, I speak out about this form of abuse, as well as just enjoy my life and reconnect with my dad. I'm also forming a coalition of adult child survivors of parental alienation so that we can change things for the next generations of children to come.
Hi, I'm Maddie, and welcome to the Anti-Alienation Project. Today, I'm honored to be speaking with Sacheen, a former alienated child and abducted child, who is here today to share her story.
Thanks, Maddie. It's nice to be here.
To anyone listening, before we delve into today's conversation, I would like to extend a gentle request to our audience. Our guest today has shown incredible courage by being here. It's really not easy to speak out against this particular form of severe psychological child abuse because it does typically involve your family of origin. So if you could kindly offer your support and encouragement in the comments, it would mean a great deal. Thank you for your understanding and your empathy. What are your earliest memories of your childhood, and do you have any memories before the alienation began?
I don't have a lot of memories because I was so young. But the one that obviously stands out the most is the day that my mom took me away from my dad on a bus.
So if you don't mind, can you tell us more about where you're from, how old you were, what you recall, or what you've learned since about that time?
I'm from British Columbia, Canada. I live in Kelowna, BC. And my mom abducted me from my father when I was 4 years old. And she moved me to Hope, BC, which at that time there was no Coquihalla highway. So the Coquihalla highway is something that is much faster to get from Kelowna to Hope. But back then it was a really old, windy Hope Princeton highway. And it was probably about 6 to 7 hours of drive time away from where my dad was, which was in Kelowna.
What were your memories during that time? Do you have any recollections or sense of what life was like?
Not much. I do remember there was one time I was scared. I was hiding behind a couch. I don't know the whole story or anything like that, because I don't remember. But the thing that I do remember the most, that stands out the most, was the day that my mom took me and we were on the bus and I asked her, when am I going to see daddy again? And she said, I don't know. And I remember when she said, I don't know, I remember my heart just kind of going, it just dropped. Like I was like, what do you mean you don't know? And then of course, you're a child. And so you start to go, well, what did I do? Like it's my fault or something, right? Because kids do that. We're very young, we're very ego-centered, we don't know anything, we're the whole world, the whole universe, right? And so when you're like not understanding what's happening. So I remember just kind of watching out the window and just being like wanting to run off the bus and go back to my dad. I do remember that.
Oh, that's heartbreaking. I'm so sorry. Do you have any memories of your dad from before you were abducted?
I do have memories of my dad, and ironically, I remember picking fruit with him because there's
Oh,
an abundance of fruit trees. There were no fences around. We could just stop on the side of the road and we would go and pick fruit off the trees. And when I asked my dad about that, he said, "Oh, yeah, I took you to work with me one day and we did that." And I was like, wow. So I remember those types of things, but they're so few and far
mm,
between. I did ask him one time, I said, "I remember I was in my tricycle riding outside in the front and I got into big trouble." And he said, "It wasn't me. I didn't give you trouble. I didn't do it." So I was like, "Hey, but I do remember getting into big trouble." So anyway, I wasn't supposed to be outside.
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even I wasn't abducted, obviously, for people who know my story. So I can't even imagine how traumatic, how confusing, painful that must have been as a child. Do you recall anything else your mom told you, or did you ask her for more information as the months went by, or is that blocked out of your memory?
I don't think I asked. It was like I already knew, just don't
Yeah.
ask. Even when we went to Hope, because both of my dad's family was both spread out over Kelowna and in Hope. So when we moved back to Hope, some of his family was there. They lived there. And I remember walking by some of the houses that they were in, feeling so sad and
Mm.
just wanting to like go there. I remember missing them, right? So those are the types of things that it's more a feeling, right? So when I have,
Yeah.
which happens now, sometimes I'll still have emotional flashbacks, right?
Mm.
And not understand them because it's a feeling, then you can't always verbalize it, right? Like I couldn't
Mhm.
understand why I felt so sad,
Mm.
but I knew I couldn't ask.
My
It
goodness.
wasn't safe to talk about it. And it's just like I inherently knew that. Yeah.
Right. I know the feeling you're talking about. Did your dad know where you were moved to, or was he unaware of where you were living um, as a child?
He knew I lived in Hope. I do think there was one time shortly after she took me that he may have tried to come and see me. We were staying at my mom's brother's mobile home at the time, and my mom's youngest sister was babysitting me. I don't know if it was my dad or another family member. And I don't remember a lot of it, but I just remember I was going, I don't know what I'm supposed to do.
So from the age of 4, and then how long was it before you would see your dad again?
I don't remember seeing him at all in my childhood. And I suspect if I did, it was probably so emotionally stressful, or I was feeding off of the energy of whatever was going on, because my mom would always talk bad about him.
So that's what I
And
wanted to get into next. Can you describe what some of your earlier memories in childhood were like during the alienation, or what tactics your mom used to convince you of things about your dad?
so she would say things to me like, don't talk to strangers because, and of course, I had blocked out, I was obviously over time blocking out the memories of my dad, even what he looked like everything, right? And I remember I would walk to school by myself when I was a little bit older, whatever, but she was always like, don't talk to strangers. And your dad and his family, they might want to kidnap you to get back at me. So I was always, when I was walking to school, now imagine me being under 12 years old, walking to school, always looking over my shoulder, thinking there's some crazy man out there that's going to kidnap me to get back at my mom. Not understanding my mom was the one that kidnapped me from him, right?
It must be so confusing for the child who's going through that, and you feel like you got everything backwards.
Yes. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
all reversed, it's all inverted.
Yeah. You're not the first person that I've talked to whose mom said the same exact thing regarding the abduction. That
Uh,
their dad is from the Hells Angels. They're going to kill them. They are going to abduct them. They're going to kidnap them. Yeah. Wow. So that must have been really terrifying as a child.
it was because I was thinking, who are these people? Like, how crazy are they? And children, why would their parents lie them? We don't,
Mm-hmm.
like as kids, we can't imagine our parents lying because we're just born with love. We're open,
Mm-hmm.
we have to be taught to hate as children, you know? And it's sad because what happens is you don't just learn how to hate that parent. You learn how to hate the part of you that is that parent. That's part of
Mm-hmm.
your existence.
I'm really glad that you said that, because the damage is so much deeper than just missing a parent. It shapes your beliefs about your parent, but also yourself in the world because of
Yeah.
that. So it sounds like she really instilled fear in you of your dad.
Yes, a
And
lot of fear. And his family, even though when I saw his family once in a while, I didn't have that fear. It wasn't there, right? So she put me from here into my head And
That's
then a rumination and all these, then of course the trauma because now you're thinking about everything. And then she would add things like, well, he's a deadbeat who doesn't want you, which of course I can't see the contradiction because I'm like, well, if he didn't want me, why would he want to kidnap me? That doesn't
good
make
point.
sense, right? So I'm like, what? Anyway,
That doesn't, it's like that doesn't really add up, Mom.
no, yeah. But
No.
that was part of the narratives back then, she claimed domestic violence and, all that stuff. And when I had finally reunited with my dad and his side of the family, and I asked, like, would he have ever hurt, like, where did she get that from? Why would he ever hurt me? And they said, absolutely not. He never would have hurt you. Like, but my mom married my stepdad when I was about 6,
Okay.
and he adopted me.
Oh, wow. I'm not surprised. That's also very common.
And all I heard about was my dad doesn't pay child support, right?
Mm.
So I've got this price tag on my head about, okay, so he doesn't want me, but he wants to kidnap me to get back at her. And he doesn't pay money, but I can't see him.
That must have been very confusing.
It was very confusing as a child because you can't make sense of any of it. And you don't expect that the parent who feeds you is lying to you. But then when you look back, well, we all lie to our kids. We tell them Santa Claus exists. So, I mean, we're trying to help them believe in magic, but the reality is we're actually lying to them.
That's true. And people forget that you can make a child believe horrible, negative things that aren't true as well.
Yes, so you can believe magical things, but you can also be easily manipulated because kids are all good, all bad, black and white thinking under the age of 12,
Mm.
generally around 12. Yeah.
So when you look back now, do you think that your mom was doing this consciously, or did she believe some of this stuff herself? Or maybe you're not sure.
I think if you tell a lie long enough, you begin to believe it.
Okay, yeah.
And when I did eventually email her and say, like, you hurt me by taking me away from my dad and not having him in my life. And then she turned around and she said, well, I didn't do any of those things. And, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm like, okay, but you do, because even my mom and my stepdad's son, my half brother,
Mhm.
who's 8 years younger than me, even he hated my dad and he didn't even meet him. So, she was talking negatively, and I'm taking all that on, right? I'm like, you're putting down the side of me that is that man, not realizing that, well, okay, well, if he was so crazy, then why did you have me? I remember there was one time when I actually screamed at my mom, you know what? I didn't ask to be born because I felt like such a burden to her because everything was such a big chore. And, when you're a child, you don't understand it.
No. So what was your relationship with your alienating parent, your mom, like during those years?
I was aligned with her because I didn't have a choice, right? She enmeshed us. I was always either with her or I was with one of her friends, sometimes after school. According to my dad, my grandfather tried to stand up for his rights to be a dad, but as my dad told me last night, my grandmother was the queen bee of the hierarchy in the family. And of course, what she says goes, and narcissism runs in the family. So, and my mom did say, it's funny, she says this to me one time, but she said, who was a narcissist? Your Nana. And I'm like, well, isn't that
Interesting.
interesting? And then I'm like, realizing, okay, so is she, and then of course it rolls downhill and I went, oh my gosh, was I? And did I damage my son because of that? Right. So with
Mm.
the guilt and the whole ballooning of everything is just like it's a big explosion of what just is going on anymore, right? And then of course my mother and my stepfather also tried to get in the middle of me and my son and alienated him from me. Like basically he moved to the US because they signed a passport for him to leave, and he's autistic.
So your mom has now contributed, and your stepfather, to alienating your son from you? I am so
Yeah.
sorry. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
and that's
Okay.
what people also need to understand, that it'll continue to go on.
Yes, this is the reason I moved across the country. I know my mom would alienate me from my kids. I'm so incredibly sorry, and I want to talk about that more. But first, I want to back up, if it's okay, to a little
Sure.
bit more of your childhood and your
Sure.
adolescence. Do you remember your emotions you had, if you had any, towards your mom? Was there a lot of good feeling, or was it a mixed bag, or were you angry? How did you feel towards her as you got older?
Like the lost child, I was kind of invisible. I just had to go along with whatever was going on, you know, and she had that look that if you just, you know, if you do something and she gives you that look, then you know, you're like, okay, like, you know.
Yeah, because you can alienate without saying a word because they give these micro expressions where their
Yeah.
true selves come out, and as their child, you see all of them, and it's
Yes.
scary.
Yeah, it
Wow.
is. It's very scary because you just know that. And I think when I'm thinking back and even hearing stories from my stepdad of her throwing frozen roasts and frying pans and things at him, she was the one that was very reactive to things. And I was afraid of her reaction. So, you know, I was afraid of both of their reactions, to be fair, because she would also threaten me with my stepdad.
What role did your extended family play in the alienation, if any? You mentioned your Nana.
Yep. So my Nana was, and I think it was because she had a status in the community, and it was always, you know, what would the neighbors think type of household, and you know, don't air dirty laundry, but yet they would talk about everybody in town. But she worked at the bank, the one bank that was there, and so you know, you get status, and then you get the power, and then you get the influence, and what they ended up doing mostly was gatekeeping me. I don't
Okay.
remember any phone calls from my dad. I don't remember, you know, so whether he phoned or not, if he even knew what our number was, there was nothing. Like he was just like, all of a sudden he was gone and he was this deadbeat that didn't pay.
Have
Right?
you since learned anything from your dad about what that experience was like for him on the other side?
To some degree, but we still haven't gone through all the details. There's so much to know, and of course, you know, his birthday was just yesterday, and he turned 69. So I'm like, I want to know everything as fast as I can, you know, because he also had cancer. He's beaten it twice, thankfully. So I feel like time's kind of running out, and so I want to know like the whole I want to know everything as fast as possible. And I know that it's so hard for him. And well, it's hard for both, all of us, everybody, even, you know. Like I'm
Ah,
staying at my dad's sister's right now. And I'm like, I even said to my dad last night, like, I don't know how to feel like family, but yet also feel like I'm strangers. It's like this, there's this weird thing going on, right? Like I want to connect, and as a therapist, I know questions to ask people, but here I'm completely lost. I don't know how to ask questions. I don't know what I should say. But when I talked to my dad last night, and he realized, or he told me, well, my family didn't really like your mom. And I'm like, well, after all she did to you guys, of course not.
how could you? Sorry,
But I'm
that's a
like,
little mean, but
okay, well, that's going to make it a little bit easier for me in the beginning because then we can, you know, maybe talk some stuff and get it out in the open. But then at the same time, I'm like, gosh, I hope they don't look at me and see her and then hold
no,
resentment to that. Yeah.
no,
So
no.
that was, and he said, no, that's not it at all. And I'm like, okay, I hope not.
I've had
Because
the
when I
same,
look in the mirror
yeah,
and I see my mom, I don't like that sometimes, right?
that resonates with me. I want to talk for a moment before we move ahead. I want to talk about the effects that the abduction and the alienation had on you because I think that most people in society, first of all, don't even know about this form of abuse, but then also don't recognize how destructive it is on not just a child, but a person, their personality, perception of the world, trust issues, you know, self-esteem, whatever it may be. The list goes on and on. So it's 4 years old, you're abducted, and then you're after that cut from your dad, alienated, and it's like a fork in the road, and your life took a different trajectory. What were some of those effects on you, your life, your anything that you'd like to share to people listening to give them a comprehensive idea of just how destructive this is?
You know, I had a lot of childhood friends growing up, but then when I got older, I had a hard time connecting with women. I had a hard time connecting with other peers and stuff. And I think subconsciously it was because I knew how covert and mean they could be because I lived it. And so I was always just kind of like, you know, and I had encountered so many people like that, even in my teenage years, right? I didn't like the cliques, the popular people. You know, that was very hard for me because that was just more kind of, you know, snide remarks and gossiping and all the things that I was raised with. I didn't want to be around that anymore. I didn't really fit anywhere either. I would just find people that I liked, or I would I would walk home with somebody who was a loner because they would be bullied. So I would try and stick around the kids that got bullied and stand up for them. Maybe that was because I couldn't stand up for myself when I was young. And, a lot of people I've realized and come to learn over many courses and everything that many people go into the helping professions because of their own trauma. And I do remember going into a mental health because that programming of childhood and even being told that my dad's family was alcoholics, I was like, well, why would someone choose alcohol over a child? But then I realized in the last few years and all this trauma work and stuff that it's just a perpetual cycle of trauma and these people are just coping. And not every alcoholic is violent or, any of that stuff. Even if somebody's relying on it, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But that was the program I was given. His family they're alcoholics, they're dangerous, they're this, they're that. And never having experienced that, or at least feeling like they were ever dangerous to me, right? The funny thing about it was that he was the alcoholic, apparently, and she would go out almost every weekend. I was babysitting my little brother at 11 years old. I was parentified to watch him so that they could go out, and I would hear every weekend, oh, how hungover everybody is, and oh, but it was such a party, and blah, blah, blah. So while they're out projecting that somebody else is the alcoholic and that's why he can't be with me, they're out partying or doing this and doing that. And I'm watching my little brother, who through my teenage years, I began thinking he's the golden child because he's my stepdad's son and he's the new family. And I'm just the outcast, the burden, nobody wants me and I'm just kind of hanging along. So in my adult years, a lot of the time it's been hard to believe that I am lovable. It took me a long time to realize that I am lovable because I always felt like I was unlovable.
Absolutely.
There was hardly any affection when I was growing up. My husband now actually helped me with that a lot. He's very affectionate, thankfully, because that's what I needed, So
Shout out to
that
him. That we all
yeah,
need someone to show us that we're lovable and that we're worthy of
yeah,
love. So that's
yeah,
awesome. I'm really glad you
exactly.
have him.
Thank you. Yeah, he's definitely been my rock. Well, we've been each other's rock because he also sees his stepdaughters in me. He sees the pain of his girls in me because of what I've gone through. And he's heartbroken over what he's had to go through, but he also is like, I'm so glad that you're here so that I can understand it a little bit better. And maybe if they ever come around, because I'm like, I see myself in both of those girls too, right? The angry older one that lashes out, and then the lost, invisible younger one. And I'm like, I've been all of those parts because when you're alienated, you're so shattered,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. I want to get to that point in your story, but I still think that we might be missing some in between.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So you get older, your teenage years. When did you start to question your mom, or did you question your mom and think about your dad or try to get information? What was that like growing up?
So I lived in Hope. We moved when I was teen, and when I was 12, there was a boyfriend I had who I took because we had a phone book back then. Because my age is going to show, but we had a phone book, so I was looking through there, and I'm trying to find the last name and the addresses of where these people are because it had been so long. And I reached out to my grandfather. So my grandfather, who was the same one at the funeral that we talked about earlier before the recording. I went to his place with the boyfriend I had at 12 years old because I was still afraid, right? But I wanted to know. So I reached out, and my grandfather was thrilled. He was just ecstatic that I showed up at his door. And that was when I was 12, sometime when I was 12. And then, of course, my mom and they moved me half an hour away, at least half an hour to 40 minutes away. So they made it harder for me to just walk over to see my family or the parts of me that I wanted to learn about, my heritage, right?
Wow.
I didn't know that back then, but every time I would reach out and try and find them, we'd move.
Do you think she was trying to isolate you from them, or trying to hurt him, or both, or
Both,
something else?
that she could maintain control.
I feel like I keep wanting to say, I'm so sorry. because I can also relate to a lot of this. And
Yeah.
it's a type of pain I think I'll be healing from for the rest of my life, parts of it. So I just hate to hear this when other people share their stories. It's empowering and it's meaningful and it's very important, but it's also just,
Yes.
do you remember seeing your grandfather at age 12? Do you remember what that was like?
Seeing my grandfather, I remember a little bit. I don't remember a lot of it because I was still so scared, right?
Okay,
He
okay, go
showed
ahead.
me a picture he had kept of me since I was 4 years old in his wallet.
Oh,
And I was like, oh, like you still, okay. So he never badmouthed my mom. None of the family has ever badmouthed my mom. And I'm like, but she probably deserves something, And there's that part that you just want to make her kind of pay in some kind of way for what she did, but knowing that you can't do that because then you're attacking the other side of yourself, and it's just such an imbalance. And I guess what healing from parental alienation is trying to figure out the teeter-totter and bringing it level. And it's going to have to go back and forth a little bit until you can find that balance, right? I tried to reach out to my dad again because I had his mailing address.
okay.
I was able to get his mailing address. And shortly after I was sexually assaulted in school, I desperately wrote to him because I don't really know why. I think I just didn't feel safe because I was in my mom and my stepdad basically blamed me for it. And so I was reaching out to my dad to be like, I just needed to know that there was a male that would love me after all of that, right? And not understanding what was going on because you're trying to figure out your identity when you're a teenager, right? So,
What was
anyways,
that like when you reached out to him at 13?
he wrote me back, and every time the targeted parent responds, it breaks down the wall a little bit more. It's like if he didn't want anything to do with me, he would not have responded. I would not have got this letter from him. But I don't know, I don't remember how I got the letter. So my mom and my stepdad probably realized that, and then we moved again on my 16th birthday.
Okay,
Yeah.
so she just kept moving you further and further away.
Yep, they were always just, yeah, because by this time now we had moved. So I moved from Kelowna to Hope for the first 4 to 13 years. And then I was moved from Hope to Agassiz between the age of 13 and 16. And then I was moved to the end of Vancouver Island on my 16th birthday. And that's where I stayed most of my youth because I ended up at 17 getting engaged to a 29-year-old. And that was just continuing more of the abuse of, well, maybe some man out there will love me because nobody else seems to. As you were talking about how did it affect you, it definitely affects the relationship with that sex, right? The programming of the deadbeat dad and the all everything, you're like, well, that's not going to happen to me when I have a child or whatever. And yeah, it's a whole big cycle, and we don't recognize that we continue relationships that we're familiar with from our childhood.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's something that I've seen again and again, and believe it or not, in our support group, oh man, probably 3/4 of people are targeted parents now too, or targeted step parents. It's very common, and right now it seems like one of the main ways people are figuring out they were an alienated child is by going on
Yes.
to have their children alienated from them, which is the last way people should be figuring this out. But I know exactly what you mean. And honestly, I was on the path to repeat the cycle too. So it's very common. And I think people, maybe we can mention briefly for people who might not have a background with having been through trauma or abuse in their family, but yeah, it is familiar. It is, you probably know way more about this than I do, being a therapist, but it's almost like when people treat you in a healthy way in a relationship, it's unfamiliar and uncomfortable if you haven't been raised by people who are treating you well.
It's very true because when you're so used to being treated like you have to people please or you have to earn their approval or their love, even though their love is conditional, if you're earning it, when you have somebody that isn't like that, they're more safe and they're secure, you're going, who are you? Like, what is this? I don't understand what this is. I like it, but I don't understand why I didn't have this before.
It can definitely open your eyes to what was lacking and how cheap the other type of conditional love really was.
When you
Yeah.
finally feel accepted and lovable and worthy, that's also scary because you're like, just like that, someone can take that away from me
Yeah.
again, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's something that a lot of us, I think, that I've heard that a lot of my friends and we've talked about is, that needs to come from within us at the end of the day, and learning how to have that come from within. But so you get married at 17 to a much older man.
I did get married at 19, but I met him at 17. We were engaged when I was 18. We were married when I was 19. It,
Okay.
it all happened very quick over my graduation, basically. Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that marriage at all, or do you want to
It was,
briefly?
I can do real quick. It was, I didn't talk a lot about this for a long time because of my autistic son. I don't want to, I
Okay.
never ever wanted to put him in the middle of any of it. But now that he's older and, we've talked a lot and I've tried to help him through a lot of these things. He knows that his dad was 29 and I was 17. How much he understands, I don't know. A lot of the patterns were repeated, only it became something that was, a lot of gaslighting. It was a lot of keep the house a certain way. You have to, I was a chef once upon a time, so you have to cook my meals this way. And your duty is to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen and serving me because I'm the breadwinner. All these things. Like it was he would stalk me when I was in a little town of 1,200 people. Why are you stalking me? There was a lot of sexual coercion where he would keep me awake at night and accuse me of having an affair if I didn't want to sleep with him all the time. Like it would just, and I've heard instances of men with the other way where the women will withhold sex as a punishment. A lot of the same patterns. It was just familiar. All these things that we repeat are all subconscious programs that we get as children that we carry into our lives forward, right? When my ex-husband punched the wall when my son was 4, of course, right? Everything happens at, right? So
Wow.
when my son was 4, I told my ex-husband I didn't want to be with him anymore, and he punched the wall beside me. And then he ran into my son's room and he said, "Who do you want to live with?" So he started right away that parental alienation. And when he did that, I was like, "Oh, we're not doing this." Like I'm like, I have to appease him. And it took me a good 7 years to figure out how to get out of that because it was so isolated. I had no skills, no schooling, no income. Because he married, I was so young, right out of school, he married me, right? And when I told him even before we got married, I said, well, we can put it off. He said, no, we're getting married right now. But of course, that's a lot of the narcissistic programming, and they've got to move things fast along because they can't keep up their mask and their charade for very long. But then once you're in the marriage, now how do I get out? Now I have to try and work and build. And yeah. And then, of course, when I finally did leave, and I told him I was leaving, he started to put my son in the middle of things and be like, your mom doesn't want to, your mom's breaking up the family. And, all these, she doesn't want to be here. And basically putting all the blame on me and trying to align my son to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I told him, stop using our son as a therapist. And in fact, I was going to wait until the end of the school year to leave. And I left on April 1st because I said, if you're going to do that to him, and I already had looked into like interim temporary custody. I'd spoken to lawyers. I did all my research. I did my due diligence because I wanted to make sure that my son wasn't going to be alienated from me. And I also didn't want to alienate him from his dad, but I knew I could not stay there because if he was stalking me when we're together, what's going to happen if I just get an apartment in the little town over here, right? So I had to rip that band-aid off real quick. And then I headed again, back to the Okanagan. So I ended up staying with my mom and stepdad for a while until I could find my own place because they left Vancouver Island right after I had my son, pretty much 8 months later. And then they went to the Okanagan. So there I was with a newborn baby, just finished high school. And now I'm married to this man. And I vowed to my son that I was not going to do the same thing that my mom did to me. I was not going to do that to him. So it's just kind of a quick summary of how the cycles continue, and we don't even realize it until it's too late. And then you're like, now what do I do? Right. So
Absolutely.
learning one of the counselors that I went to, my very first counselor I went to that my ex-husband made me go to, was very aware of abuse, and she taught me all the different types of abuse. She taught me how to be assertive. She taught me how to take my power back so he couldn't control me anymore. Things like that. I had people in town that were saying, if you need a safe place to go, you can come here. In all seriousness, you can come here. And I'm like, when I have people in the town telling
Mhm.
me that I need to get out of there, and even some of my stepdad's family, one of his brothers, said, you need to get out of there.
Wow.
That says a lot.
So during your marriage with your first husband, there was no contact with your dad during that point. It was still no
No,
contact.
no, yeah. And I had actually apologized to him about that too. But I said, I was going through my own things, but part of what we do. So, when I left though, and I was closer to my original roots, I again started to go, okay, well, I'm really curious about my, that dad side of my family, and some of them are here. And one of my dad's brothers, my uncle, who has passed away now, my grandfather sent him to find me because my grandfather had built me a hope chest.
What's a
And
hope test?
a hope chest is one of those, because he was a woodworker.
Uh-huh.
So it was this chest, and it had a big covered compartment container that you could put different things like your dishes. It was supposed to be a collection of what I could use when I was going to move out, right? And I was going to graduate. So it was beautifully hand done. He was really good at what he did. There were two drawers in the bottom, but it was just this beautiful wooden chest that was initially, and he kept it for me all these years. Like he did all that. And so
Wow.
these are the things that bring the alienated child back to that family, because they don't stop loving you, they don't stop thinking of you or doing things even though you're not there. So it was that the fact that my uncle reached out, we were able to do that on Facebook. So I do give kudos to Facebook for being able to connect us to my, extended, estranged, alienated family that was safe enough at a distance until over
Mhm.
time, right? Because that fear programming is so deep. It's so deep.
That's beautiful. It seems like that letter your dad wrote you back when you reached out, he wrote you when you were 13. It's like I have moments like that too when I look back and I'm like, we were so close. I was so close to like knowing something was I it was like close to putting the puzzle pieces together, but like a misconnection almost. Yeah. So when your grandfather brought that over, did anything come of that, or was it just breaking through the barrier a little bit more?
It was breaking through the barrier a little bit more. But I was connecting more with that family. So I was connecting more with my dad. My dad came over one time with one of his brothers and helped me with my car because my car was having problems. So they worked on my car. Just these little things that I felt like, okay, well, that's a safe thing that they can do to help or whatever. But the big ones are the impact of, wow, like you kept all of these things all this time. When I reconnected with my dad again, he gave me pictures of me that he kept. One of his sisters gave me my baby book that they had, so all these things that the targeted parent will hold on to in the hopes that one day, my dad never thought that I was ever going to come back into his life.
Oh, really?
That's the part that's the hardest.
So how old were you when you did see him again?
I was in my 30s, but I always kept them at arm's length because of that fear, right? Even though I'm an adult, like he can't do anything to hurt me anymore. So it wasn't logical, but I couldn't, it was the brain program, it was a brainwashing, right? And it's just that, oh,
Yes.
well, why, it doesn't make sense. But at the same time, here's this man and his family who are doing all these things for me, and they're inviting me to lunch because they want me to be a part of the family, and I'm going, so I'm so confused, because why did they not want to have a part of my life when I was a child, and now they do? It didn't make sense, and there were still pieces missing, right? And thankfully, through my husband, and the safe and secure relationship that we have, and that I was able to see it, I was able to finally put those pieces together, because it made me realize that, well, if she's doing that to those girls, maybe my mom did the same thing to me.
So did your husband know the term parental alienation or anything like that? Or did you both observe the phenomenon and you kind of put it together that way?
Well, we put it together that way. But the funny thing is that when I first because I got a general diploma originally in psychotherapy,
Mhm.
right? And applied counseling. So when I had that, it was basically general knowledge of everything about mental health. And then you have to find your niche, right? So I'd heard about narcissism and all this other stuff, but I hadn't delved really that much into it because I worked mostly in addiction recovery at the time, and some developmental disability. And I had different areas that I would venture off into, but I hadn't really studied a lot about narcissism. But my husband, he had mentioned it right in the beginning. He's like, narcissism, she's a narcissist. And I'm like, what? So with my ex-husband, my first husband, I was Googling behaviors because there wasn't a name for it, right? I was just like, what is this? Why these things happen? Why does he do that? So when I started learning more about narcissism and all of the personality types that can cause these alienations to
Mhm.
occur, I was like, holy smokes, this is exactly what I lived, right? And
So,
seeing how it played out kind of as a bystander to it because I was removed from it. So I could just see how the interactions were and that kind of thing. And, even my stepdaughter's mom did not want to continue going to the counselor that was supposed to help them, and so to help the girls. And so I was like, wow, like this is huge. And so in doing all that, I was reflecting on my own childhood and going, so many parallels that I couldn't help, but I had to look at it. I had to go back deep within and go, wait a second here. This sounds like the same playbook that I lived through. So,
what was that like for you?
um, devastating. It was devastating because I'm like, why do women, that's all I had known, why do women do this? Right? Because my mom did it and then she was doing it. And now I am going to say my ex-husband tried to do that. Thankfully, he wasn't able to. But I don't know all the depths of what my son went through when he was with him. I know every time that he would come back to me, I'd have to undo the damage. And I say that nicely because there were different rules. I don't know what was said. There was a lot of neglect. There was one time when I was called on the phone by the Ministry of Children and Families, which is the equivalent to CPS, because my son had been left outside in the car on Vancouver Island while my ex-husband decided he was going to go and gamble.
Oh my gosh.
He was 11 or 12. My son was 11 or 12 at that time. And I remember calling my ex-husband and saying, you're going to make me lose my son and it's going to be all your fault. And if you ever do that stuff again, I will make sure you don't see him because you're endangering his life.
Right.
Right.
Which is the huge difference between manipulating your child to believe the parent's abusive or neglectful versus an actual parent who is neglectful or abusive.
Yes,
So that must
exactly.
be really hard to manage as someone who's been alienated by a parent, because of course you don't want to do that to your son, but at the same time you want to protect your son. So I can't even imagine how confusing that must be.
Yeah, that was a hard one. But, again, I don't know. My son told me that even after he went afterwards, he would just leave him in McDonald's. And I'm like, that wasn't any better. And I wish I
Jeez.
knew that, but I couldn't. Anyway, so that's what happens. We would just repeat the patterns. We repeat all the cycles with the new
Well,
partners and the upbringings. Not anymore. No, that's why we're here. We're breaking all these cycles now. So
yes.
that's what's good about doing this work.
Yes. So when you figured everything out, I'm always curious for myself personally, just to know what that's like for other people, because for me, it was earth shattering, life altering, like panic attacks all day long for a few months straight. What was that like? How did you get your head around it? Did you reach out to your dad, or did it change your relationship with your mom? What were the effects?
Well, in the past 5 years, since it's in 2019, my grandfather's funeral, where my dad was at, and we all went, the whole side of his family was there. In February of 2019, when he introduced me as the daughter that was taken from him, I knew that was right. I knew it was right. And the words, though, I was like, he said it. And then a month later, my body gave out,
Oh my
just
God.
stopped working. It was like, oh no, you have to just stop what you're doing and you have to look at this. I didn't know that that's what was happening at the time to my body. I didn't know it was a freeze response. I didn't understand how the nervous system worked, all that kind of stuff. But because I had been on hypervigilance for most of my life since I was 4 years old, right? Of course, your nervous system eventually is just going to go, oh, no, you got to deal with this, right? It's like a burning house, you know. You can have an oven fire and ignore it, and then you're going to end up with the whole house on fire. But you have to address all of these things, right? So that was, well, it broke me. It literally broke me. I say that to people. I broke myself. So that's why I tell people too that if you can go back and reflect on your childhood, it's going to help your health too.
Mm.
Not just your mental health, but your physical health. And it's going to help your spirit and your soul because that's what all this is. It's a destruction to a child's, their mind and their soul.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The health, the chronic abuse and stress and being in the fight or flight mode absolutely can wear on your health. Autoimmune disorders, high blood pressure, just the list goes on and on.
My dad had cancer twice and he's got his own childhood traumas, right? That
And the
I'm
trauma
learning
of
about.
losing you.
Well, that in itself, yeah, is a huge one,
It's for
never
the
mind all
targeted
the
parents
other
as
things
well.
he went through. Yeah,
My
exactly.
dad also developed autoimmune disorder after everything with their divorce and the alienation with me. And I developed an autoimmune disorder too, the same time. It's so weird. But it sounds like your body really put up a fight. And then it was just like, I'm sorry, Sacheen, you're taking a break.
Yeah, yeah, it really did because I had been pushing myself and pushing myself and I was
Mm-hmm.
ignoring things. I knew I was ignoring things. I'm like, I don't have time for this. I don't have time for that. So my body's like, you're gonna make time for it, you know?
Really smart. So, did you confront your mom ever?
I did. I emailed her. She lashed out at me. She would always talk badly about, even me being on Facebook and Facebook friends with them. She'd be like, oh, this person, blah, 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 I didn't even recognize me. Looks terrible. Always. And I'm just like, do you ever stop? Yeah. No, and we know they don't now. But yeah, so when I did, I sent her an email and I told her, you really hurt me by denying me access to my dad and taking me from him and talking badly about him. And I did a whole big long email and she responded with basically denial and not going to take accountability for anything. And no, I didn't do such things. And I never talked to you about your dad, before, under 18, because I knew you were too young, blah, 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 all these things. And I'm going, and then she called me abusive. I'm like, so my hurt feelings are abusive to you. Well, that just goes to show that now I know who the abuser really is because you did the same to my dad, and now you're calling me that I'm an abuser. So I knew right then, I was like, no contact. We're over. She wanted to throw everything under the rug, and I'm like, no, we're not doing that. Elephant in the room right now is getting exposed, and that's what's happening. And if you don't like it, then that's okay because you made your bed. And I have to just do what's best for me. And right now, I need to know this side of my family because you took it from me.
First of all, I just want to say that must have taken a lot of strength, and that must have been really difficult to have all of that gaslighting and the most painful things, probably some of the most painful things of your life. I'm so sorry. I also understand how no contact can be really taboo, and a lot of people can give their input and not really understand that. I believe for people whose parents are abusive, it's a last resort decision, and it's a decision you have
Yeah,
to make for your own safety and your own health and your peace and your soul, honestly.
for your own sanity and your own mental health, you have to sometimes do it, and if I don't know if anything could change, but right now it's about protecting me and the things that I want to learn. And my aunt, her sister, she said to me too, I'm 42 years old, and she sent me a message and she's like, oh, he's brainwashing you. And I'm like, I'm 42 years old and you're trying to tell me he's brainwashing me? Again, more projection, right? I'm like, I know what you guys did because even she was widowed young, and even my uncle back then, he told me that, your dad wasn't a bad guy. And I remember him saying that to me, and I was probably 10 or 11. And I
Wow.
held on to that like that was gold. Because I
Wow.
was like, somebody finally said he's not this monster, right? And I remember just going, thank you for that. I remember feeling, thank you for saying that. Thank you for making me feel like I'm okay, right? So that was good. Yeah.
So it sounds like learning the truth, hearing it out of your dad's mouth, something about hearing it maybe from his own mouth sent your body into this, no, we're shutting down. We're shutting down. And then
Yeah.
you confront your mom, you go no contact with your mom. Did your health begin to improve slowly, or what was that like? Did you notice any effects from going no contact with your mom?
I noticed that because I didn't even really like talking to her very often because she was always depressed, or she was, always something was always wrong, or she was just identifying with her physical symptoms, or, what's happening on the TV, or it was so superficial. And so I just didn't feel good anymore I didn't want to be a part of their life anymore because I was like, I don't understand. And they would put the things that I would do down, like I work in the mental health field, and then you start saying things about drug addicts. Like, I'm like, this is really hurtful to me because I work with these people and these are just people, and you're like feeling like you're so much better than everybody. And that is one thing that my dad did say to me. He said she seemed to think that she was better than me. And I'm like, she's always harder up. Like, it's always worse. I could have 2 back surgeries and she's going to have 5. I don't know. Right.
Victimization. Yes.
Yeah. And even when I did have 2 back surgeries, did I get a phone call? Did I get flowers? Did I get a visit? Nothing. I got nothing. Not from them, but from my dad's side of the family. Some of them showed up. So
Wow.
again, that just shows you, right? These people do want to be a part of your life. And the fact that somebody keeps them out of your life really should not happen. That shouldn't be their choice. It's not about them. It's about the child. It's not about their rights. It's about the child's rights, and the child's rights to have 2 parents, right? And my mom and stepdad adopting me and then saying he has to have supervised visitation and all of these things. I'm like, he's treated like a criminal. And then when I was trying to find any evidence of any police reports, because if there's domestic
Hmm.
violence or something going on, where's the evidence? Where's the police reports? I couldn't find anything.
So she
So
made up
I'm
the
like,
false accusations.
yeah. And the whole time that she was saying he was abusive, she allowed my stepdad to be that way towards me, right? While claiming he was a hero for stepping in. And realizing it all now, I'm like, it's not that I didn't appreciate my stepdad sometimes, but he caused me a whole lot of fear too, because my mom would use him as a weapon to control me.
It would have been a lot better if your mom had protected you from herself.
Yeah, it would have been. That's really who I needed protection from.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's very confusing to learn these truths because then you
Yes.
feel like I felt stupid for a little bit. I felt a little bit like, how could I have gotten it so backwards? But again, being a child, we really did stand no chance. Oh, do you want to talk a little bit about your relationship with your dad since your grandfather's funeral? With that?
Sure. It's been really good. We talk at least once a week now. Generally, I send him text messages or whatever, but we talk on the phone and stuff. There was one time, so here's the funny thing. Here's where you can tell who the targeted parent was and who's the compassionate one and stuff, because there was one time when something happened with my cell phone. We couldn't get a hold of each other for a while, and then one day he just showed up at my home. And I remember being in the kitchen and went, "What's happening?" And then because I remember being all stressed out about my dad, like I can't talk to him, my phone, we'd lost contact for a couple months, and I was like, oh, I can't, like I was getting huge anxiety because I was like, oh my gosh, like I just got a hold of him, what's happening? And then he showed up at my doorstep, and that same time that he showed up on my doorstep, I had that, what's happening? Something's good's gonna happen. And then when he rang the doorbell and I opened the door and I saw him there, I just started to cry, and I was like, how did you do that? Because like
Oh,
I could feel him before he even knocked on my door. And that is a kind of connection that you can never get in the middle of. Like, there's nobody can ever, harm that. And so
oh,
that was pretty amazing. And then he said, the one thing I've needed to hear most of my life was when I started to cry, and he gave me a hug and he said, "Oh, it's okay to cry." And I was like, "What? Like, you're not going to get mad at me for crying either?" Like, because I used to get into that, if you cry, I'll give you something to cry about type thing, all that kind
yeah.
of stuff.
That's so
So,
beautiful. Oh my gosh. I love hearing the hopeful part, the happy parts.
yeah,
It's because it's the targeted parent, I believe, that really can help you heal. And it's what gets you through all the rest of
yes,
the crap. You were talking about that anxiety that's programmed into you and into our bodies. And I've had that same, it's taken me 2 full years to be able to talk to my dad and look at my dad and not feel that anxiety. So I was just curious about you and if you can pinpoint a moment or an instance where you had a breakthrough and how you were able to trust your dad again or have that anxiety lessen.
I think it was that moment when he just showed up and I felt him before he even rang the doorbell. Like, there was some kind of an energy that I was like, something good is going to happen. So that was the moment, because it was like I was okay to just be me finally, and to
Yeah.
connect back with the pieces of me that had been shattered, start to rebuild them back up. And knowing that he was going to make an effort, and he did make an
Yeah.
effort, and he did every time he would make an effort. He would always respond, or he would show up, or he would, or his family would, just to check up on me or something. There was always something that just reinforced that, yeah, they did want me in their life. And but then, of course, on the flip side of that, there's a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger in this process,
Hmm.
because when you realize that that was stolen from you, it was literally your childhood was stolen. It is, you can't ever get that back. And that's why early intervention in these types of things must be prioritized in family courts and family dynamic situations after divorce, post divorce, separation, abuse, that kind of stuff. People need to understand what the red flags of abuse are, and to recognize, because they all use the similar tactics. And so if there's more of us than them, then we can educate other people, then we have to do that, because we don't want to continue the harm to future generations. That's why we're here trying to break these.
So, yes, thank you for saying that. That leads me to a question that I like to ask a lot of people who've been through this as a child, which is, what advice would you give to anyone who is questioning, like, maybe this is something that's happened to me, maybe this is my story, but they're not sure, they're confused. What advice would you give?
If they're just learning that they're alienated, or
Mm-hmm.
potentially thinking about it, that it's possible, I would tell them, please don't be afraid to reach out to your targeted parent, your alienated parent. That parent is sitting there waiting for the day that you text them, or you call them and say hi, or whatever. And it's going to take time. It's going to be hard. You've been taught pretty much a lifetime, your childhood, of fear. Just make sure that you ask lots of questions. And these alienated parents, they likely have things for these alienated kids. They
Mm-hmm.
carry things with them, right? Like pictures, or in my case, because it was too old. There was no evidence, right? There was no emails. There was no anything. So I also tell the targeted parent, hold on to all that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
because one day the child is going to want to come to you, and they're going to be so confused that if you can actually have something there that shows, here's what I was trying to do and here's what happened, that's going to make a lot more sense, because then the child also is going to be like, they're going to make their connections of, yeah, I was living some of that stuff, and that fits in that piece, that fits together, right? Because they're triangulated in it, and they have to take the side of the parent that feeds them.
So,
And that's the truth. And they're always going to. And people that think that this isn't real and that kids can't be brainwashed need to understand that the first 7 years of a child's life, they are the most programmable. So for people that have intact marriages or long marriages, alienation can still happen within those marriages. That's the whole
mhm,
trying process, right? Turning a child against a parent can happen whether you're together or not.
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. If you could pick the most important thing that you would like people to know about this form of child psychological abuse, what would it be?
So the psychological abuse, it can happen to anyone, right? Anyone, no one is immune from it at any age, in any profession, for any reason. And this is psychological abuse as a whole, but it comes from our childhood. Learn the red flags. Be careful to follow your own gut instincts or inner guidance, because we've been taught to ignore our instincts, and we've been taught to be in our thoughts, which isn't always a very good thing, because that's where rumination happens. That's where the anxiety comes from, all of those things that we tell ourselves, our narrative that isn't ours, but it was given to us, right? Challenge everything you thought you knew in your childhood by what generational trauma has been passed on. Start with your own reflections. The ACEs question, which are, there are 10 questions. For those who don't know what the ACEs is, Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. And you can find that on my website, which I'll give at the end of this interview here. But when I took that questionnaire, and it's only 10 questions, it really helps highlight, and divorce is in there as one of them, along with different types of abuses. It helps you to realize, when you see your score, how these things have impacted your childhood, and it might help open up to how it's affecting your adult life now, because relationships get carried forward, right? It's a cycle. What we want to do with people that are in psychological abuse is help their critical thinking. And
Very important.
yeah, so just enhancing, getting kids curious, or, anybody that's endured psychological abuse, getting them curious to the critical thinking, well, how did that happen? Or what could be another story, or, anything like that. But with parental alienation, we need to understand and hear out the other side of the stories. We need to hear it from the targeted parent, because only then are we going to be able to piece what's really true. And you're going to feel it. You're going to know it's right. You're in cognitive dissonance when you're in parental alienation, right? Your mind says one thing because that's what you've been programmed to do, and your heart and your energy is feeling and saying something else. So that's what I tell people. Try to move into more heart-centered and try to just really go into what is the truth I feel is right, especially if they're older, because like I say, we didn't have emails. I lost my letters that my dad wrote me, and I thought I had them in safe places for a long time because I did keep them. I kept all of them. I kept pictures. His wife, actually, when I had reached out again at 18, his wife also wrote me a letter inside and said, he never denied you. I always knew when I got together with him, the first thing he talked about was you. All these things. So all of those types of things, all of those seeds, they all matter and they all make a difference. And it doesn't matter how small you think it is, and I've apologized to my dad for my rage at him, and he said, you don't need to apologize. And I said, I do, though, because I feel like I do. And I know it wasn't me, but you didn't deserve that, right? You didn't deserve that. And kids come in with love, and we need to make sure that they stay in love and that they're not taught to hate, because really the hatred isn't towards the other person. It's back, fingers pointing back. It's just at you, and it's not worth it. It's not worth it to hold on to that hatred and that anger.
I love that advice. It's great advice. I have a question that wasn't on the list I gave you,
Oh, that's
but
okay.
yeah, it just came to me. If there's anything that you would tell yourself as a child when you were going through all of this.
That he loves you. You are lovable. He loves you, and you're worth it. And when you get older, they can't hurt you anymore. The programming can't hurt you anymore. So you try, and you need to reach out, and you need to understand that side of what happened. And that is actually your right. As an alienated child, that is your right. And part of your healing is going to be reuniting with that targeted parent. That's going to make all the difference.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's beautiful. You did mention before the interview started, and I don't want to keep you much longer, but I wanted to hear what you talked to your dad about, if you wanted to share anything that you've learned talking to your dad last night or throughout the past few years. Anything you've learned, or how did he respond?
Yes.
Anything at all you'd like to share?
I have. I actually just sent him this text message earlier today, and he sent me back a picture of his mom, my grandmother, who I never met. And so that was nice to see. I found out that my dad was 15 years old when his dad left their family, their home, and left my grandmother. And he said he stayed with his mom at 15 years old to help raise all his siblings because she couldn't do it. And she had her own trauma and her own issues. He did say she was boozing it. So that is part of the story. But my mom didn't know her. And so my mom was saying bad things about his mom without even knowing her, right? And I said to him, I think that's an amazing thing that you stayed to try and help out your siblings. I said, but what a huge trauma in itself. That's a big thing for you, a big responsibility at 15 years old, that, just realizing that we do pass these traumatic things down, and people cope in the best way they know how based on their upbringing, their environment. And it doesn't make it right or wrong. You have to understand it. You have to understand where it comes from. And all the stigma around, drugs or alcohol use or addictions or any of these things, when you look at where it comes from. And my mom told me one time, she said, oh, your dad said he wanted to grow up and be an alcoholic like his mom. I'm like, I don't think anybody ever says that they're going to grow up and be an addict or something. Nobody does that. So none of that made any sense to me. And of course, in all the trauma and recovery work I've done and deeper delving in the neuroplasticity and all of that of the brain and how trauma affects the brain and everything. It's so much bigger than just, well, that person's an alcoholic or that person's a whatever. It is multiple layers of things, right? So the message that I sent to my dad today, I said to him, I take my glasses up here. I said, I forgot to mention the biggest thing my mom did that made me realize I needed to cut them out of my life is when she called me abusive, when I told her she hurt me by not allowing you in my life in my childhood. So she does that to me, and then my hurt feelings towards her are abusive. I said in an email, no less. I said that's a not a good counterattack. She doesn't get to tell me that she didn't hurt me or you for that matter. Then she proceeded to attempt to convince me that she never did such things when I was a child, teaching me to fear you and your family. Like, did she forget I was there too and had my own recollection of events after she took me from you? When I apologized to you last night on the phone, it was because of my anger towards you when you reached back out to me when I was a teenager, as well as apologizing for the distance I kept in my 20s and most of my 30s. In my 20s, I was living in an abusive marriage. And my ex was 29, and he decided me, a 17-year-old, was a good idea. Yikes, that's why children shouldn't be allowed to make adult or big decisions. Because 17, I was still a child. I don't care what anybody says. You're still a child. You're young, right? You don't know. You don't have any life experiences. I said, I admire that you stayed to help your siblings, but that's a big task and a heavy burden for a teenager. I'm sure that was heart-wrenching to go through. I am glad you always did respond to my letters and such, though, even though that anger wasn't really mine, it did sow the seeds of your love in my heart. So thank you for doing that. And yes, I'm sorry for that part because you didn't deserve it. And I said, I look forward to seeing you both and all very soon again. I hope you had a good day yesterday. And thank you for helping me heal through these conversations. I hope it helps you a little bit too. I know it's probably hard to hear my pain, as it's hard for me to hear yours. But this is how we will heal. I love you very much, Dad. Because I heard him crying on the phone last night too when I broke down. And so that's painful, right? But that's also bonding and healing. And that's what kids need, whether you're an adult and alienated or a child and alienated. Yeah. So I guess that's all I have to say is I speak up because we need to spread information. We need to expose family court for being the divisive attempt at keeping kids away, right? Keeping kids with an abusive parent.
It's really beautiful that you guys are working through that together and that you do have the unconditional love of at least one parent.
Yeah, it's great. The part that makes me sad though is that he also wasn't able to be a grandfather to my son. And he would have been the role model that I needed for him. Ironically, when I was trying to find a male role model for my son, I wish I knew it could have been him. So I want people to also realize that it's not just you, it's your kids. And it's so much loss. And when I see the pain my husband goes through on a regular basis, and it makes me so much more aware of the pain my dad went through.
That must be so incredibly difficult.
It's very difficult. We cry tears all the time together, right? Because it's something that kids and parents shouldn't have to feel like their child is a hostage. And then they have to either pay them or go to court to see them like they're your child, right? And they shouldn't be held from a fit and loving parent. And, regardless, the trauma to a child, if they're not a threat to their life, the trauma to a child is much worse for not having the parent in their life.
That's a very profound statement.
Yeah. So that's why I do this work. And yeah, I haven't worked with kids yet, but I think that's kind of where I'm headed.
On the note of your work, how can people follow you or support you in your work that you're doing?
Sure. So I have a website, and it's www.addictedtofear.org. I have been building this website for the past 4 or 5 years now, as well as trying to finish a book and helping people to learn how to heal themselves. My business name is called Elephant Training because, well, there's elephants in the room and it just made sense. So
I love it.
Thanks. So that's, you can, and I'm also on X and it's at ELEPH_training.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. This is not an easy thing to do, and it is going to change a lot of people's lives. The first part of I think changing all of this is to get it on the public's awareness, public consciousness. You can't fight something that people don't know about and change something that people don't know about, and trying to stop history from repeating itself. Because if the same thing happened today and you were 4 years old, history might repeat itself as things currently stand.
Yes.
That's why we're doing this. Thank you so much for being here. Is there anything else you would like to add before we end the interview?
Well, I'd like to thank you for having me
Well,
because this is the first time I've actually done a recording on it because I have thought I'm not going to be able to without having to stop 500 times and cry or whatever. But I also want to mention to any of those who also are realizing they're alienated, do your best to not hate your alienator because you're going to go through stages where, because it's a grief cycle, but do your best to still love the part of you that is that parent, because otherwise it's just going to be a counter destruction. And they taught hate, but you don't have to continue it, right? Like I said, I felt like I wanted to punish my mom, but I don't, because no contact is going to be enough. I have to heal myself, and she can, she can come to terms with that on her own, but I have to make sure that I love my whole self. And
mhm.
every alienated child needs to learn how to love their whole self. And if you have a hard time with that, try and find the good in that parent. Even one of the things that I thought about doing is doing a collage of the good things of both parents so that I don't focus on all the other stuff. But it's a cycle, and it's a grief cycle, and there's no right way to heal. There's no time frame. You're probably going to be doing this your lifetime. That's the work we're here to do. And we're going to make big differences in the lives of other children. And that's why we're doing it. And I think that's really the key here is we have to stop other kids from feeling the pain that we felt. And so thank you so much for everything that you do, Maddie, because your work is, it's very inspiring and it's helpful to me, and I get to share it too and create more awareness.
Well, thank you for being here. I really admire you, and I think that to face all of this and come out the other side a kind and caring person says a whole lot about your character. So not everybody could do that, and your son
Thank
is
you.
really lucky to have you as his mom.
Oh, thank you. I needed to hear that today.
Thank you for watching today's episode. Please leave your encouraging and supportive comments for Sacheen down below. They always generate a really helpful dialogue in the comment section. If you were a former alienated child who would like to share your story or join our support group, please reach out to the Anti-Alienation Project at gmail.com. We would love to hear from you, and I want you to know that you're not alone. Thank you for watching, as always, and I'll see you next time. Bye.